And welcome. Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce and to moderate today's event, which focuses on a historic document recently brought to the light of day. We, of course, at the Kennan Institute value many of the things, most of the things perhaps associated with George Kennan, and this has a certain kind of Kennan association, not that it was written by Kennan, but it was a telegram that we have in mind for today's conversation. It was also a long telegram, and for those of you who have had the pleasure, I'll just hold it up for a moment, who have had the pleasure of reading this in its original form, it looks remarkably like the long telegram of George Kennan's that you can access from the National Archives. So it has a number of things in common with that famous text, but this is a text written, in fact, by Wayne Merry, who's here with us today, in 1994, so many decades after the original long telegram, and instead of probing the vast architecture of the Soviet Union as Kennan's cable had, this is a cable that is addressed a bit more to U.S. policy and to potential errors and mistakes of U.S. policy in the early 1990s. But before we get directly into the event, a few housekeeping items. Please keep abreast of Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website, subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and Russia File, and also tuning into our podcast, The Russia File. I'd also like to thank the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program for co-sponsoring today's event. And for anybody who's not in the in-person audience who wishes to address a question to one of our two speakers today, please do so via the Kennan Institute email. That's kennan@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll get the questions to our speakers. And now to an introduction. Wayne Merry is a senior fellow for Europe and Eurasia at the American Foreign Policy Council. He spent 26 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, including in the post of Political Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the early 1990s, the time from which this historic document originates, and is, in the intervening years, has become a widely published author and frequent speaker on topics related to Russia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Balkans, European security, and transatlantic relations. So, frequent guest and friend of the Kennan Institute. Welcome back, Wayne, to the Kennan Institute. And it's my pleasure as well to introduce Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya, who's a senior analyst at the Archive, the U.S. National Archive, National Security Archive, sorry, and since 2001, the director of the Archive's Russia programs. She leads the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program of the Archive, focusing on the Non-Lugar Initiative and the ongoing challenges of U.S.-Russia cooperation, is the author of several books, most recently The Last Superpower Summits, Reagan, Gorbachev, and Bush, Conversations That Ended the Cold War, published with Thomas Blanton, who's here in attendance, in 2016. And that's that for the introduction, so welcome both. And we will start with a few remarks from Wayne. So Wayne, the floor is now yours.
Michael, thank you. As somebody who has been a frequent guest of this Kennan Institute, it's a pleasure to be able to occasionally contribute something here, either as a speaker or as a writer. The one complaint I'm going to make is that a number of people very generously have compared my Dissent Channel telegram to George Kennan's long telegram. I want to make it clear that that is not a comparison I make at all. Partly because I knew Ambassador Kennan when I was a graduate student at another institution named for Woodrow Wilson. This was at Princeton University, where I was a student to James Billington, somebody who had a rather intense relationship with both this Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center. And that's how I got to know Ambassador Kennan. And one of the things that he said to me that has really stuck in my mind and affected my professional approach to being in the Foreign Service, including twice at the American Embassy in Moscow, was he said that when he was in Washington in the early 1950s, the problem was he was dealing with all these people who had a lot of textual knowledge about the Soviet Union and even about pre-Soviet Russia. They'd read a lot, but they did not have what he called Russian mud on their shoes. And this was a phrase that he used rather intensively, this notion of having Russian mud on your shoes as a necessary means to understand the place. That phrase stuck with me. I took it with me into the Foreign Service, not just to Russia, but to every place I served. And found out that in Moscow, the people with whom I served, who I felt had the best understanding of the place we were in, were those who did have Russian mud on their shoes. I remember a conversation with one colleague who was complaining that there are too many people in the diplomatic corps just simply didn't understand why you had to stand in 3 lines to buy a loaf of bread. You know, that understanding that was essential to understanding the place, and not just to complain about it. And this was something that I got to serve in Moscow twice, and I do regard that as a privilege and a pleasure. And in both of those times, my focus was really on listening. I felt that I had very little to say to Russians in either time, but I had a great deal that I wanted to learn, and my mentors in the Foreign Service taught me that the most effective form of diplomatic communication is listening. And I essentially equated that with how one gets Russian mud on your shoes, metaphorically, though I actually got a good deal of it on my shoes, literally, as well. Some of it I never got off. The second time I was in Moscow was in the early 1990s, and I was great good fortune to be assigned to the head of what's called Political Internal, which is a reporting section, one of 3 political sections: political military, political external, and political internal. I had served at political internal in the Brezhnev era, absolutely loved it, partly because my job allowed me to be the most traveled Foreign Service officer in the embassy. Got to 76 cities of the Soviet Union during that tour. And of all the place tours in the Foreign Service, the one I wanted most was to be the head of political internal, and didn't imagine that I would get it. I was very fortunate when it came to me, and I brought with me this notion of we're here to get Russian mud on our shoes. And the section that I headed when I first got there in the summer of 1981 was 18 people. We lost about 6 of them when we opened the new embassies, but we were still one of the largest reporting organizations in the American diplomatic service. And I'm happy to say it was composed of people who understood perfectly why we were not there, as in the old days, to peruse Pravda. We were there to get out of the embassy. In fact, as much as possible to get out of Moscow itself, and to get Russian mud on our shoes. Now, the first couple of years of this, during the breakup of the Soviet Union, I would say were just absolutely joyful, not only because of what was happening and to be an eyewitness to these things, but that the morale and within the embassy was extraordinarily positive. And I say that particularly about our colleagues in the economic section, who were also very much getting a lot of mud on their shoes. The third year, things changed. And they changed because, of course, the administration in Washington had changed. And the new administration had an attitude toward Russia, which was somewhat pretentious, to put it mildly. And it was not really about so much shock therapy, because shock therapy had already come to Moscow in the form of the so-called 500-day program of Yeltsin and a number of other people, though I'm given to understand that a lot of the 500-day program, in fact, originated in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But in a lot of what I think changed the attitude in the relationship between the political section and the economic section was a different concept that had come into American policy, which was the end of history. Now, not everybody actually used that phrase, but the attitude was certainly very apparent and very strong, which is we no longer have anything to listen to in Russia because of the end of history. And so we're not getting any mud on our shoes. We're not doing any listening. The job is for them to be listening to us. Now, it's not that I didn't think that they had a good deal to learn from other people. In fact, one of my favorites was from Margaret Thatcher, who tried to explain to Gorbachev that what makes a market economy work is not profit motive, it's enforceable contract. And this notion that what's really at the heart of economic reform should be political and legal reform was, it turned out, a major problem that we had understanding ourselves. That the end of history crew really didn't understand that there was more than just economic theory, the so-called Washington consensus in its various aspects, but was also about constitutional and political reform. As it happens, a good deal of what is in my enormously too long Dissent Channel message is really not about economic reform at all. It's about constitutional and legal reform. And in my view, the most important single thing that had taken place in Russia in the Yeltsin era was Russian public attitude toward legality, which most Russians, in my experience, regarded as extremely important. And Russians felt very, very proud that their country had not gone the way of Yugoslavia, Romania, Georgia, other places which had had political violence. And the reform process was, of course, undergoing a significant effort at constitutional reform in the summer of 1993, and involved some extraordinarily talented people that we got to know. I mean, one was Oleg Rumyantsev, who did not object if people compared him with James Madison, and Valery Zorkin, the head of the Constitutional Court, whom I got to know rather well, was even a guest in his home, and who did not object to being compared with John Marshall. But what happened in the fall, as people will remember, was that Yeltsin, for a variety of reasons, some of them, I regret to say, influenced from this side of the Atlantic, decided to essentially abandon legality as in the pursuit of reform. Now, the attitude that Washington had toward the events of early October of 1993 were ones that I disagreed with very strongly. The view in the Clinton administration was that our guy is Yeltsin, Yeltsin won, therefore we won. The question as to whether or not Russia won when Yeltsin decided to abandon normal, peaceful politics and opt for the use of force in the fall of 1993 was one that I felt was one of Yeltsin's three great historic errors. And this became, I think, the moment at which I was separated from my own government in our attitude toward what was happening in Russia. Now, this accentuated as we went into the electoral process in December of 1993, where I'm bound to say the taxpayers got their money's worth, but the U.S. government didn't make use of it. Our reporting and analysis on what was going to happen in those elections was dead on accurate. I did a very extensive message 2 weeks in advance as to what the outcome of the election would be. As we got closer to the election, we actually got access to the opinion sampling that was being prepared for Yeltsin himself, but that his staff were afraid to show to him. And so there was no reason for Washington to be in the slightest bit surprised by what happened. Nonetheless, the vice president was in Almaty the day of the election, preparatory to coming to Moscow on the next day for a celebration of the triumph of the economic reform program that we had been pushing. That it was going to be rejected by the Russian people should come as no surprise. I got a phone call on Sunday afternoon from Almaty from one of the staff accompanying the vice president, and I was very blunt. I used a phrase that was a favorite of my high school physics teacher, and I said that the Gaidar was going to get his butt kicked. In fact, we had done very detailed analysis based on opinion sampling that had become available to us. So there was no reason for anybody in Washington to have been surprised. Unfortunately, when the vice president and his team did arrive the next day, the question was under debate, should we tell Yeltsin to cancel the election? Should we tell Yeltsin to essentially abandon his own constitutional referendum? Happily, he did not do those things. I mention this because we were now in a position in which the United States government was essentially seeking to impose on Russian reform things that would have been utterly inconsistent with the basic fundamentals of what was necessary in terms of legality. It's unfortunate that the Constitution that was approved in the referendum had significantly deviated from that which had been under preparation the previous summer by people like Rumyantsev, and had been changed in ways that made it effectively an effort to combine the constitutional procedures of de Gaulle's Fifth French Republic and Adenauer's German Federal Republic, thereby creating a fundamentally inconsistent constitutional document with one or two imports from the American side, which made it even more inconsistent. Now, this became a difficult process for me. My job as head of political internal was both to supervise a dozen extremely talented and productive reporting officers, which I did. Happily, most of them were so talented and such good writers that just about the only thing I had to do was to put my initials on their drafts. But I was also, as part of my job, supposed to be doing detailed, lengthy analytic reporting. Every head of political internal that I've ever known has understood that that's part of the job. And our colleagues at the National Security Archive have managed to get a few of those telegrams and get them declassified as well. So I don't want anybody to think that the Dissent Channel so-called long telegram was in any way unique. It was unique in terms of its excessive length and in terms of the fact that it was a Dissent Channel message. But other than that, it was the kind of thing that my job called for me to do. And my predecessor and my successors have done very much the same. What it did, however, now become was a problem of clearances. Up until quite recently, the political and economic sections had cooperated in our reporting and cleared each other's messages with very little difficulty. Now we had a problem is that some new supervisory personnel in the economic section had arrived, who I would say had no Russian mud on their shoes, but who very much were part of the end of history school of thought about Russia. And there we had some real problems. Some of this I describe in detail in an essay that was published along with the telegram by the National Security Archive, so I won't go into it here. But it did create a situation in which the 70 paragraphs went into Washington, not as a front channel message, which would have had normal distribution, but as a Dissent Channel message. I'm going to say a few words about Dissent Channel in the State Department. It was created in 1971 as part of the results of the Vietnam War, where there had been a lot of complaints within the Foreign Service that people couldn't get their opinions and what they had learned in Vietnam through to Washington. It was created by Secretary of State William Rogers, whom I'm bound to say I came to regard as a very, very fine Secretary of State. I entered the Foreign Service the next year, and I can remember very clearly in our entering class briefings, we got a short briefing about Dissent Channel. I don't remember who gave it, but I remember what he said, and I can quote it verbatim. He said, "Of course, if you use it, you will never be promoted again, but you can use it." That is verbatim. That's what we were told as incoming Foreign Service officers. I found over the years that that attitude toward dissent was consistent. And I never really understood it, because in one instance, when I was on loan to the headquarters of the Marine Corps, I happened to be involved in a dissent issue. I won't go to tell you what it was about, but the commandant of the Marine Corps' attitude was, "You damn well better tell me what this is." His attitude was, "If you know something that I need to know, it's your responsibility to tell me." The idea that you should feel restrained or that you would be punished about it was preposterous. I mean, I think it's because, as somebody explained to me, this is a guy who had seen men die because he hadn't been told what he needed to know. That attitude was not what I encountered in the State Department. In my first Moscow assignment in the Brezhnev era, I got to know some honest-to-goodness Soviet dissidents. And what they told me about their experience of being a dissident in the Soviet Union, where they were regarded as not just as subversive, but as potentially insane because they didn't agree with what the party or the state said, came to feel very familiar to me in the Foreign Service and in the State Department. And I still do not understand why that institution has that attitude. I didn't encounter that attitude when I worked at the Treasury Department, let alone the 2 times I worked in the Pentagon. However, it did in the State Department, and I expected that having filed this very long Dissent Channel message, which I believe may still be the longest Dissent Channel message on record, that I would be persona non grata when I left Moscow and returned to Washington. And that is true, I was. I found out that I was not assignable at State. Fortunately, an Army 1-star Russia specialist friend of mine was then working for Secretary of Defense William Perry, and found me employment there, though it took 4 requests from the Pentagon for me to be employed, to be loaned there. The last one being from Perry to his counterpart, Warren Christopher, who had no problem. He didn't understand what the institutional problem was. And then my last and final assignment in the Foreign Service was on Capitol Hill in the Commission of Security and Cooperation in Europe's so-called Helsinki Commission, which requested that I would be assigned there. They were refused 3 times until the chief of staff there got the commission chairman, Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York, to send a letter to the then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. A friend of mine on her staff told me her reaction was, "Why do I get letters like this? Give D'Amato what he wants," knowing full well that a mere cabinet member does not profitably get involved in an arm wrestling match with a member of the Senate Finance Committee, least of all Al D'Amato. Now, I would like to conclude with a suggestion about Dissent Channel. I know in 2016, the Congress reformed the FOIA law, Freedom of Information Act law. I would like to suggest that they at least consider the next time they're looking at FOIA reform, that Dissent Channel messages after an appropriate time for declassification, I mean, mine was 30 years, should automatically be included in what's called the FRUS, the Foreign Relations of the United States series. Most Dissent Channel messages are not enormously long. Most of them are really quite compact. And for anyone using the FRUS in the future to get a sense of the formulation of United States foreign policy would, I think, benefit by having Dissent Channel messages included in that series. I also think that that would tend to encourage people to make use of Dissent Channel messages so that policymakers could have the benefit of a wider range of opinion, and that would improve the quality, hopefully, of American foreign policy, and that we would not do things like we did, a decade later in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, at the moment, the only mechanism we have for getting Dissent Channel messages to a broader scholarly or academic readership is the National Security Archive. And since they are the people to whom I owe the fact that we're sitting here today, I now happily turn over to Svetlana.
If I could just very briefly interrupt, and thank you so much for all of that, Wayne. Anyone who has questions, especially the online audience, please begin formulating them now. In the online audience, you can submit those questions to the email address kennan@wilsoncenter.org. Dr. Savranskaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I can't tell you how happy I am that we're here and discussing this wonderful document. And in addition to being substantively very important, I think it's a great read. It's written so well. So I will briefly touch on three things. Why is it important to even talk about this? Second, I will tell you about how we got the document. And third, I will very briefly disagree with Wayne. He says it's not the long telegram. It's not the long telegram, of course, right? But it's definitely the long telegram of the 1990s. That's how I think. So, first of all of you who are interested in Russia, study Russia, or come from Russia, probably remember that in the spring of last year, after the death of Alexei Navalny, the Navalny Manifesto was published, where he expresses his hate toward the reformers of the 1990s and blames everything that happened now in Russia on them, saying that they are the ones who betrayed us. They are the ones who betrayed democracy. And then that was followed by a three-part documentary about the 1990s titled «Предатели», the traitors. It's a rough documentary. It's worth seeing if you want to debate something really hotly. But it just underlines the fact that 1990s are just now coming to real serious analysis in Russia. Less so in the West, but especially in Russia, the narrative, the interpretation of the 1990s is very important. And I will just quote the last president of the Soviet Union and the only, Mikhail Gorbachev, who said in his one of the last interviews that what we're experiencing now in US-Russian relations is total absence of trust. And he said, this trust was not undermined yesterday. It happened long ago. The roots of the current situation lie in the events of the 1990s. So it's really worth to look back and talk about it. So how did I find this document? I first heard about the telegram from Sherry Jones, the wonderful documentary filmmaker who worked a lot on Russia Today. I counted, she made 8 documentary films dealing with Russia. But the most important one, I think, relevant for our discussion today, is called The Return of the Tsar. And it came out in May 2000, right? Actually, the pub date is May 8th, 2000, which is the day after Putin's first inauguration. This film is mandatory watching for everyone who is in this room or listening to us on the web. Because in that film, she predicts so many things, but also very importantly, she interviews Wayne Mary, and he talks about this conflict within the embassy in 1994. I met Sherry in the mid-1990s, and I remember in either 98 or 99, she told me about this telegram, that there was this conflict in the embassy with the political internal section criticizing, sharply criticizing U.S. policy of radical economic reform toward Russia, supporting the Russian policy of radical economic reform, and that there was this person, this diplomat, who wrote a cable which they tried to suppress. I don't remember that she was going into detail, but I knew that some such document existed. And then I tried to find it. I then knew it was a Dissent Channel message. So when I was trying to request it, my colleagues who had experience with requesting Dissent Channel messages, they said to me, you know, it's a dead request. You know, you will never get it. If you get it, most of it will be redacted. And by the way, most dissent messages are not very substantive. So the difficulty with requesting Dissent Channel messages, at least until 2018, was that they were under something called B5 exemption to FOIA law, to Freedom of Information law. The B5 exemption reads like this: interagency or intra-agency communication forming part of a deliberative process. So we did request a lot of documents in the 1990s. And one of the biggest successes at the archive was the request for Strobe Talbot materials, which was rejected by the State Department, and we had to go to court. We won the case, and I began getting about 300 pages of documents every 6 weeks for the last 3.5 years from the State Department, which is like a monthly present that I get it, I do nothing else, I just sit there and read. And in October of last year, I opened my new fresh hot release, and I see this telegram, and literally from the first paragraph, I realized this is that legendary dissent message. And I just knew it because I knew so much already about the substance of it. So as I read it, the first thing that came to mind, both because of the length, but also because of the depth of analysis, it's the long telegram. And I suggested to Tom, I said, let's do a posting and call it the long telegram of the 1990s. And, some people said, to make it more searchable, we have to be more specific. I said, whatever else we say in the title, it has to be called the long telegram of the 1990s. And of course, I sent it to Wayne. I sent it to a couple of other people who were interested in it. And so this is how we got it. We did not get it through a specific request, because for a very long time, requesting dissent messages was hopeless. We got it through another request, and from 2018, Now you can request Dissent Channel messages. They would be declassified at the 25-year period. So now I will say just really a couple of words about why we think it is the long telegram of the 1990s. Now, we haven't seen all the dissent messages of the 90s, we'll see. But number one, and this is how it compares to Kennan telegram, it provides deep analysis of Russia. Not just of that particular moment, but really deep analysis of the Russian society, of historical background, even very similar to Kennan, of how geography influences politics. Second, it gives advice to US foreign policy makers, which you will see a lot of advice here. Of course, the original Kennan telegram did not criticize US policy. There is a difference, doesn't have to be exactly the same, right? But it gives very specific and very smart advice to American policymakers. And thirdly, it gives predictions about what will likely happen. And, you know, I have lots of quotes here, but we don't have time. So I will just read the prediction, which you all can agree came true. If the West, with the United States in the front rank, prefers the role of economic missionary to that of true partner, we will assist Russian extremists to undermine the country's nascent democracy and will encourage a renewal of Russia's adversarial stance toward the outside world. Incidentally, we will also fail on the economic front. I advise that you read and reread this message, and you will see a lot of insights that are very relevant to today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And another word of advice to our in-person audience. If you have questions, please don't wave your hand, but send the questions into the email address I've been mentioning, cannon@wilsoncenter.org. So I'll take the liberty of asking the first question, and I see that we have at least one other question in the queue. And this is for you, Wayne. It's clear that you got quite a bit right, and we're ahead of the curve in this telegram, and I think that's what makes it a important and historic document. But I don't mean to put you on the spot in this regard. Do you mind reflecting, though, on what you think you maybe got wrong in this telegram, or what you might revise now having the benefit of hindsight?
Well, things I got wrong were multiple, there's no question. I had not read this message in 30 years. When I did read it after it came to me from Svetlana, I had two impressions. One, it was too long. But second, I couldn't find a single sentence that I felt I disagreed with. I felt that my errors were errors of omission, things I did not talk about that I should have. And if there's one major thing that's missing, but keep in mind this was written in the spring of 1994, was the extent to which the United States government was overcommitted to the person of Boris Yeltsin. Now, I want to be very clear. I have always been very positive about Yeltsin. I still think he is the most charismatic figure I have ever personally met, with Isaac Stern being number two. And when he died, I wrote a couple of obituaries about him that were mostly positive. My view is that Gorbachev was a man who deserves the credit for having brought the Cold War and the nuclear arms race to an end. But that Gorbachev never escaped from his commitment to Leninism. I think he died a believing Leninist. Whereas Yeltsin was a man who in middle age came to the conclusion that everything that he had been associated with politically since childhood had been a mistake. And I think that's a truly revolutionary individual. Question, what do you then do when you realize that everything has been a mistake? That was more difficult. I mean, initially, I think he was very positively oriented toward the Yeltsin 500-day program, which I thought was, having actually bothered to read it, I thought bore no relationship to the realities of the country they were in at all. But I think one of the things that Washington came to the conclusion that it was only Boris, that without Yeltsin, the country would return to control of the Communist Party, which was nonsense, absolutely preposterous, and that there were no substitutes for Yeltsin. And we later, this was not when I was in Moscow, but when I was working at the Pentagon, the White House basically regarded it as a major objective of American policy that Yeltsin run for a second term and serve a second term. Anybody who had seen him up close should know that he was in no fit state to serve a second term. But also the notion in Washington that there was nobody else who could do the job. There were no adequate substitutes, I think was nonsense. I think there was plenty of political talent in Moscow at the time. Not all of it would necessarily have been agreeable to Washington, but that's not the qualification that a Russian president has. Now, I think General Alexander Lebed would not have been my choice, but I think he probably would have done a more than adequate job as Yeltsin's successor. I had a choice of my own, probably nobody else's choice, and that was a man named Shumyeko. And if you've never heard of him, well, don't feel too bad. I was probably the only person who thought that he should have been Yeltsin's successor. But I mention his name only to make the point that there was plenty of talent out there. This was a major problem that Washington had of believing that it was Boris Yeltsin or the return of the Communist Party. And I think that is something I should have talked about even in 1994 and did not.
And one question for you, Svetlana. For historians, you mentioned that the 1990s is a subject of debate and discussion in Russia, and less so here on the other side of the Atlantic. For historians who are going to use this document to write their histories of the 1990s, I sort of feel like now the key question is NATO expansion, and is that what created the disaster that we're living through, or not? And this text raises really the question not so much of that, but of political economy. But I'm wondering if you'd have a few thoughts about how you would help historians to use this document, where you might encourage them to go with it, how they might use it to contextualize this period.
I think this document raises one aspect of real failure of both Russian domestic reform and U.S.-Russian relations. And that is the prioritization of radical economic reform over building of democratic institutions. The NATO expansion and other issues that arose in U.S.-Russian relations and in Russian-European relations are also very important. So it's not like this was one issue. I think it's important to see the complexity of decisions that the U.S. administration had to make and the Russian reformers had to make. And that included the domestic considerations and international considerations. And importantly for historians, I think, is the fact that the 1990s were perceived very differently in the United States and in Russia. I was in graduate school in the 1990s here, and I remember reading a lot of transitology literature, how there will be a transition in all these post-socialist countries, and transitions are different, but they will all come to one end. There will be democracy at the end, and more or less it will be kind of the same. Question is, you could put transitions in different category. And when I came home to Russia at the time, I heard my friends telling me, what, And for many people, it was the time of exciting freedom of information, access to information in the 1990s, free press, and learning about the black spots of history, but at the same time, real suffering and disillusionment with democracy. They weren't sitting there thinking, oh, we're transitioning to democracy. They felt a lot of Western advice was hypocritical, that the Russian Democrats were enriching themselves and were crooks. So I think if a historian looks at the 1990s, it is important to keep this in mind, how the 1990s look from inside Russia and how the 1990s look from the United States, for example.
It occurs to me, Wayne, that the text of your document is very close to the time that Fukuyama is publishing his book, The End of History, which is getting a little bit of a rough treatment this afternoon. The End of History thesis from both of you.
No, his book came first. His book was well before mine.
Much earlier.
Yeah.
So let's turn now to a question from Karen and Jack Siegel. How good is our information about Russia internally today, given that all of our consulates are closed? How can diplomats get Russian mud on their shoes? We're back to the mud.
Well, the question of how young Americans can get Russian mud on their shoes, I think is profoundly important, because I got involved in Russian affairs in some of the worst period of the Cold War. But we as diplomats or just as students had access to Russia as a society of a kind that we have not had for years. I think the situation we're in now is much worse than the worst period of the Cold War in terms of just being, I mean, the notion that any American traveling to Russia today risks being used as a hostage in a prisoner exchange is just dreadful. And where do you learn the language? Well, I understand that we now send some of our language students from the State Department to Kyrgyzstan to learn Russian. Well, but I mean, that's sort of like when George Kennan went to Riga to study Russian back during the Stalin era. I mean, surely we can do better than this. I mean, I think the situation we're in now, in terms of the two societies not communicating to each other, is much more disadvantageous to us than it is to Russia. Because we live in an American-centered world and an English language world, young Russians will have the ability to learn about us. But young Americans now are not only don't have the opportunity to explore and learn about Russia, but now the temptation to do so must be very low, as opposed to studying Chinese or anything else. I fear that the amount of talent that the State Department and other parts of the U.S. government will have in the next generation or two to understand Russia is going to be dangerously low, really dangerously low.
And an additional question from Thomas Remington of Emory University. Is there a danger that we, as American policymakers, experts, analysts, overestimate how much influence we actually have over events?
Can I just say thank you to Tom Remington? He's my dissertation advisor, who understood Russia always. And Wayne.
Well, yes and no. Do we as Americans, particularly in Washington, greatly overestimate our sort of influence and role in the world? Oh yeah, absolutely. On the other hand, don't kid yourselves. We are living in an America-centered world, and that includes Russia. And there is no question that in the early 1990s, our wisdom was unfortunately greatly exaggerated by most people in Russia. They thought we knew the answers. The reason so many people in Russia came to us for advice and the answers is they assumed we had them. Trouble is, we also assumed we had them, but we didn't have their answers. One person I knew who ran a program for USAID was to bring together retired American businessmen with enterprise managers in Russia to essentially convey the wisdom of what it was like to be a businessman in our country, to be a businessman in theirs. And she told me after 2 years that she felt what she had accomplished was to convince 150-odd Russian enterprise managers that we did not have the answers to their problems and they were going to have to find their own answers. And by the way, she probably had more Russian mud on her boots than anybody, any of us here will ever meet, because she was a translator on a Russian trawler in the North Pacific. She knew Russian words that, yes, yeah, well, I won't go. But no, but I think that's a fundamental problem that he raises.
The next question is from Marjorie Balzer. How much did you include, if anything, on the significance of encouraging real federalism in Russia, given that this was a period of Yeltsin's bilateral treaties? Were the republic's increasing empowerment acknowledged? And if so, how did you feel about it?
In this particular piece of writing, none at all. I mean, I didn't address federalism. I mean, there's 70 paragraphs in this thing. You can't talk about everything. As it happens, I did some other writing in which I specifically talked, which may be declassified someday, about what I call the Okrug issue, is the fact that in the constitutional system there, you had pieces of real estate and population that were both parts of territorial entities and parts of ethnic entities, sort of as if people in an American Indian tribe in Oklahoma would also, be in part of, in the Congress. I thought it was the federalism issue in Russia was fascinating. I wrote about it actually quite a lot, and nobody in Washington ever reacted in the slightest. Nobody gave a damn. So.
A question, Wayne, about the 1992 election, since I think it was implicit to your framing of the text. Had George Bush Sr. won a second term, do you think the kind of wrong turn that seems to again be implied in your text might it have been a little bit less severe, might it have been different, might have been another wrong turn?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because one of the things that George H.W. Bush brought to Russia policy was Robert Strauss, who was my ambassador there, and whom I'm basically got to say I loved Bob Strauss. I mean, I just absolutely thought he was a wonderful ambassador, and I think just about everybody in the embassy did. And he encouraged us to do things that I can only describe as getting Russian mud on your shoes up to your elbows. I mean, he really encouraged that kind of thing. I think that had Bush been reelected, it would have meant perhaps Baker not returning to the State Department, but Baker continuing to be in a major policy position. I think you have to recognize that the new Clinton administration came in pretty much totally ignorant about Russia. They had good intentions, but they really didn't know anything. And they tended to, I think, push themselves into the hands of the end of history crowd. And I think that was most unfortunate. So yeah, I think that if Bush and Baker had returned for another 4 years, we would be living in a much safer world. But that's purely speculation.
You need to send it into the email. Sorry, you need to, or write it out, yeah.
Can you say the email?
Yes, of course. It's canon@wilsoncenter.org. You write about you write about the prioritization of radical economic reform. Are there things about those reforms and their underpinnings that should still come out?
Still be revealed. I'm sure there are. I am sure that there is a massive amount of material that if the National Security Archive or other scholars get hold of, that we'll find out a great deal more. I mean, because let's be candid, there was a lot of schmutz involved in this, and we have sitting at the table in the person of Janine Waddell, the author of one of the best revelatory books on this subject, Collusion, which, right. So if you haven't read that, you should, because remember, one of the things that was created by all of this were the oligarchs. And an extraordinary thing about the oligarchs is that they're the ones who used that phrase. They called themselves the oligarchs. They weren't called that by others, they called it themselves. It's as if people are saying, look at me, I'm the robber baron. And unfortunately, the robber barons had friends in the West, not just in America, but a lot of other places. And was there a lot of schmutz involved in this? Of course there was. And some of that has come out, for example, in Janine's book, but I'm sure there's much more.
We're drawing to the end of our hour, so I just wanted to ask, first of all, you, Svetlana, and then ask you, Wayne, if you have any kind of concluding thoughts, or Svetlana, perhaps you have a question that you'd like to ask Wayne by way of conclusion.
Concluding thoughts. I think that this analysis will help us, lead us to other questions. And my question to Wayne would be, how much your analysis at the time you think is relevant directly to today? Like, for example, your insights about Russian behavior toward the countries around Russia, how is it relevant to what we see today, say in Georgia, in Moldova, in Ukraine?
Well, I think keeping in mind that the breakup of a multinational empire creates patterns of turmoil that go on for years and generations. I mean, the idea that the breakup of the Soviet Union was going to result in kind of a tidy geographic and political security aftermath was always kind of ridiculous. And we're only now still in the early parts of that. And how it may develop, I don't know, but I'm fearful. One of the things I would say is that my longish telegram really deals only with political and economic issues, not security issues. And in retrospect, I think the really big mistake in American policy was that which was identified as such by George Kennan, which was the expansion of NATO, and particularly the Bucharest NATO summit of 2008. Now, as it happened, I got to work in the person of William Perry with the most senior U.S. government official who opposed NATO expansion. And I know from speaking with him, he seriously considered resigning in protest against NATO expansion that did not even include Ukraine. I think moving the alliance to the east was extraordinarily dangerous and gets far beyond the question of who said what to whom. The question is, what was in the national interest of the United States? And anybody who wants to read things that I published after I got out of the State Department will know that I was an advocate of the United States getting out of NATO, which is, I felt, what General Eisenhower said we should do during his confirmation hearings as SACEUR in 1949, when he said that if American forces are still in Europe in 10 years, in 1959, NATO will have failed, because the objective of the alliance is not to create a permanent transatlantic security dependency, but to give the Europeans an opportunity to get their act together. Now, I later worked at NATO for a while and came to the view that absolutely we needed to get out of there, particularly with the end of the Soviet Union. So I would argue that the subject matter that my Dissent Channel message covers is a matter of considerable historical importance in American relations with Russia, but very secondary compared to what came a few years later with NATO expansion.
Well, Wayne, I would urge you to write up those thoughts in an anonymous foreign affairs piece. You can create the parallel structure with the long telegram and with that. Svetlana, Wayne, thank you so much for joining us, and Wayne, thank you so much for sharing thoughts on this truly fascinating and richly important historical document. And thanks to all of you for coming.